Hello, welcome to this revision session on the origins of the Cold War. We're going to go from the conferences all the way through to the Berlin crisis and maybe up to the formation of the Warsaw Pact today. So, we need to start at the beginning. What was the Cold War? Well, it was a war that was never really a war because nobody actually fought. Well, the Americans and the Russians never actually fought directly against each other, but they were certainly enemies and they certainly had weapons pointing at each other. And that's why it's called a Cold War. A hot war would be one that's very active, lots of people getting killed. This is a war where they're just sitting and playing games, pushing each other's buttons, trying to outdo one another, but without actually declaring full war on each other, because that would include nuclear missiles, and nobody wanted that. So why did it start? Good question. I'm glad you asked. It started as a result of the Second World War. It started because the Russians or the Soviet Union or the USSR, I might resort to calling them Russians, although technically you should call them the Soviet Union, the Soviets or the USSR, were forced into an alliance with Britain and America because the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Think about that for a second. They basically both hated Hitler. Even though they didn't really like each other, they hated Hitler more. In fact, Winston Churchill, here he is, Winnie himself, said he would work with the devil if it would help defeat Hitler. Initially, Hitler had an alliance of sorts with Stalin, with Russia, to split Poland up because both of them, not that they liked each other, they hated each other because one's communist and one's fascist, but they thought they could buy time and do what they wanted to do by making this Nazi-Soviet pact. But everybody realised that it was just going to be a honeymoon period and it would never last because they really did hate each other. And that was correct because Hitler did invade Russia in 1941. So they split Poland up. That's what Poland looked like. But then, that's what it looks like now. Slightly changed borders. And like I said, Operation Barbarossa, which technically means Redbeard, in the summer of 1941 was when Hitler went back on the Nazi-Soviet pact and invaded Russia in a three-pronged attack. Now, we don't really need to go into that, but it failed. And as a result of that, the Russians or Soviets, the USA and the British came together in a grand alliance to fight Hitler. Because we were fighting him anyway. The Americans had joined because Japan, who was friends with Germany, had attacked Pearl Harbor, and now Hitler had attacked Germany. So the two sides were set, and the Grand Alliance working together, fighting from two opposite sides, us and Americans coming from the west and the Soviets coming from the east, invaded Germany and defeated Hitler, surrounded Berlin. Well, the Soviets did. And then the two sides met. You can see in this bottom arrow, the American and the Soviet forces met on the banks of the river Elbe. And that is where the two sides stayed. Now, at that point, things are still friendly. And you can see them smiling. They've defeated their enemy, but it quickly turned to a much worse situation. So I keep calling them Russians, but it is the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union is Russia, which is by far the biggest country in that union, but with quite a few other important countries in there as well. Now, you might see CCCP, you might see CCCP on Russian missiles or even the international football team. It means USSR, but it's just their Cyrillic alphabet rather than the Latin alphabet. So that just means the Soviet Union, which is written like that in the Cyrillic alphabet. And the USSR means the Union of Soviet, which is these councils of workers and soldiers that were set up during the revolution of 1917. So that's the Soviet Union, which is an easy way to say it. But the full name is Unions of Soviet Socialists, because they are left wing communists that believe that people should own what they produce and let the government run it for them. Republics, because it is not just Russia. A republic is a country that hasn't got a king. And obviously, we know that the Russians executed their Tsar, their king, and all these states, most of which had the Tsar as their king as well. They all joined together in this union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it's there. It's huge. Russia's still the biggest country in the world, but it was even bigger when it was the Soviet Union as a country. And there it is in relation to Europe. I'll come back to this map with the other red countries and blue countries and what that means in a second. Now, the Soviet Union includes what we now know as Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all these other ones. They're part of the same country at this point. Do not get them mixed up with the satellite states like Poland and Czechoslovakia, which are separate countries, although they are communist and linked to the Soviet Union and almost controlled by the Soviet Union. Right? They are separate countries with their own communist governments. These are all parts of one country, which is the Soviet Union. The whole of Cold War. It breaks up at the end of the Cold War into the countries we now have, but it is one country with one leader. And they are allied to the other countries, like I mentioned Poland, Czechoslovakia, in Europe, China to a lesser degree, who are communist, and Vietnam. But the other side, the capitalists led by America, are allied to these lighter blue countries, which become known as the NATO countries, or Western democracies, including countries like Australia. Now, in Europe, we have a clear split between East and West, where you've got countries which are in NATO and are capitalist. You've got some countries which aren't in NATO but are still capitalist, like Sweden and Finland, Switzerland and Austria. And then you've got these satellite states, and I'm going to explain how that happens in a short while. But they are allied to the communists in the Soviet Union. So why did the USA and the Soviet Union become enemies if they were in an alliance, a grand alliance, throughout the whole of the Second World War? Well, it's partly down to what I mentioned, that they all hated Hitler more than each other, and when Hitler had gone, there was the reason to be allies had gone. But it's partly to do with the personal views of the leaders at the start of the Cold War, Winston Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin. They didn't trust each other, and they wanted what was best for their country. Churchill wanted to protect the British Empire, whereas FDR didn't really give two hoots about our British Empire. He was more concerned with Soviet expansion, and Stalin was determined to protect communism and thought that the other two were just out to get rid of all communist countries. They were very different. They had different beliefs, and they didn't trust each other. Here are a few of their views. I'm going to give you a second or a stop screen and see if you can guess, or not guess, use your brain to figure out which one belonged to which leader. You can pause. You can unpause. So the first one was Stalin, the second one was Roosevelt, third, this one was Churchill, that one was Roosevelt, that one was Roosevelt, and that one was Stalin. So they believed in very different things. Two of them very much anti-communist, one of them very much pro-communist, which is probably the biggest reason why they fell out in the end once Hitler had gone. Their systems of running countries and their ideological beliefs and how countries should be run and how people should live their lives was very, very different and not really compatible. democratic countries believe in voting and believing that you should have rights. Soviet Union have the belief that the government should, that everybody should be equal, and that the government should run everything, that there should not be elections, the government should force people to share out everything. And the reason why they're like oil and water is because they both need other countries around them to be the same. If capitalists who need to be able to trade with each other, and it's all about money, which is what capital is, they need other countries to trade with, and other countries won't trade with them if they're communists. Whereas communists feel that if other countries are next to them are capitalists and have money and pay rich people more than poor people, that their equal society will be torn apart because the people who are getting paid the same, even though they're more skillful, like rocket scientists, for example, will move or try to move to these capitalist countries to get more money because they're greedy. That is known as a brain drain. So there's a couple of diagrams here that show you how it worked, that generally in capitalism, it is a cycle where people give money to set up businesses, individuals give money to set up businesses, which workers work for. They produce goods which are sold in shops and make profits for the businessman, who then puts more money into businesses and gives some of that to the workers. In the communist system, the state or the government plans everything and taxes people, which then goes to build the factories. It doesn't come from individual investment. That produces goods which get sold in a shop that's run by the state. Profits then go to the people and the government. So they're both different ways of running a country that don't really mix, is what you really need to remember. Now, both these systems, both these countries, really valued their system and thought that theirs was the best and worth defending to the death. And they both believed that beating Hitler was a result of their system. So the Americans thought that it was because they were capitalists, defeating an authoritarian fascist regime showed that democracy was better than dictatorship. Whereas a dictator under Stalin, he believed that it was a victim for communism, and because they'd fought harder and longer than the West, really, that they had the right to then take, give, not give or take, to exert influence over the countries that they had liberated from the Nazis. So both of these countries became superpowers. Britain, France, and Germany had essentially shot their bolts in World War II. They had overextended themselves. Two of them had been invaded and, well, not destroyed, but completely defeated. And Britain had been fighting for the longest, had spent so much money on fighting this war that they were in debt for the next, well, they still are, to be fair. Which means that the Americans and the Soviets became the world leaders, but very different ones. You can compare the two in terms of size. Russia, Soviet Union is much bigger, but not that much bigger population, because in East Soviet Union, in Siberia, there's not many people who live there. By 1980s, the Soviet Union's had a lot more nuclear weapons, but that changed over time. The Americans started with more. And by 1984, the American economy was much healthier, although those two numbers were closer earlier on. So that's how you judge a superpower. And they were relatively equal, although I would say the Americans generally had the edge further into it, which is why they ended up winning the Cold War. So how did this division, this Cold War, actually start? We know why it started, due to the leaders, due to the ideological differences, and due to the fact that Hitler died and they both hated him or they hated each other. Well, it didn't. That's where the Grand Alliance decided that they were going to liberate France and worked together to defeat Hitler. 2 years after they'd started this Grand Alliance, they planned a two-pronged attack on Germany, and that was in Tehran, which is now the capital of Iran. So they discussed how the Americans and the British would help the Soviets by attacking in the West, and it would take some of the pressure off the Soviet Red Army that were fighting in Stalingrad in the East and other places, not just Stalingrad, but famously Stalingrad. And so they came to the conclusion that Britain and France would invade by 1944, and they did a month later, well, just into June, with D-Day on the 6th of June, and that when Nazi Germany was defeated, Britain and USA would get the the Soviet Union support in the war in the East with Japan. So no problems there. It's only when Hitler looks like he's going to be defeated that problems start rearing their heads. So the same guys meet in Yalta, which is in Crimea, which is disputed territory at the moment between Ukraine and Russia, but because both of them were in the Soviet Union at that point, it is in the Soviet Union. And they decided what they were going to do once Germany had been defeated. And this probably is the beginning of the end of the Grand Alliance. And you could even argue that this is the start of the Cold War, although there are other aspects or other events that have that claim as well. So the outcomes were that Germany would divide into 4 zones of occupation, with Soviets, Britain, France, and the USA controlling a zone each. The capital would be subdivided into those 4 zones too. All the countries freed from Nazi control, East and West, like France, for example, and Holland, but also in the East, Poland and Czechoslovakia, would be given the right to hold free democratic elections. But Stalin was offered this sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and that becomes a major point of contention later on. Stalin again reinforced his idea that he would join against Japan once Germany was done, and they agreed to set up a United Nations to prevent any further wars. So Hitler was then defeated, but Japan wasn't, and they met once again. I say they, it is now Stalin and 2 new people. FDR had died, Churchill had been voted out, so it now was Truman and Attlee who joined Stalin, and this is where things really became obvious that they were falling out. And whilst Yalta, they did have a little bit of contention, a little bit of conflict, Potsdam was really, really difficult. And it's partly because even though the others didn't trust each other, Truman was even more anti-communist and very open about that, whereas FDR was a little bit more, what's the word, tactical. He's a bit more, that's not the word I'm looking for. He was a bit more, he was less obvious in his dislike of communism. And the Americans had tested a bomb already, and they told the Russians what they'd done, which was pretty provocative, to be fair. It was saying, look, this is what we can do, don't mess. Right, now Hitler's gone, right, we're the big boys. And then the elections, because Hitler had been defeated, that were supposed to be taking place, Stalin had not made any moves to give those countries free elections, so it looked like Stalin was going against his own word from Yalta. So you need to know what they agreed on, where they disagreed, and how well they cooperated for each of those 3 things. You can remember the important points are people, who was there, the elections, what they agreed, or if they said anything about elections in the countries that have been occupied, what was going to happen to Europe, who was going to have the influence, and this idea of reparations, which Russia wanted, and the Allies didn't. So at Yalta, they agreed that Russia would be allowed to take reparations, but didn't set an amount. And by Potsdam, they were arguing about how much the USSR could take, and eventually they agreed they could take whatever they wanted from the Soviet-controlled zone in the east and 10% from the Western zones. But that wasn't very well received by the West. Okay, let's see from what I said if you can pause your screen and then try and match up the description with the conference. The conference is in the right order, the descriptions are not. Okay, pause and unpause. Oh, you already have. Okay, so first one, it was Yalta. The second one was Tehran, and the middle one was Potsdam. Right. So the seeds of Cold War have been planted at the conference, particularly Potsdam. It now develops even further with what happens afterwards in the couple of years after the end of the war. And if we go back to this diagram, you can see the first E was about elections, and elections is where it starts to really fall down, because some of those countries that the Red Army had invaded to get to Germany in east of Europe had actually fought against the Soviet Union, particularly Hungary, who were quite right-wing and allies of the Nazis, had been fighting against the Soviet Union. Now they're controlled by them. They don't really want to be. Now, Stalin believed that the West would be okay with that, even though they'd asked for free elections. He believed that they were given this influence, this sphere of influence, partly because Churchill had made a deal with him on this scrap of paper, which you can see here, about who should have what percentage of influence in each country. And Stalin believed that that meant that he could basically do what he wanted, according to Churchill. And then that is what it actually means if you can't read the writing. One country that was particularly important for the Soviet Union was Poland, because it was between Germany and them. And Poland had been the corridor for attack previously. It was Poland that they went through, the Germans, to get to Russia in Operation Barbarossa. And by having Poland as a communist country that was allied to the Soviet Union, it gave them a bit of a buffer zone, like an airbag sort of thing. And the other countries were part of the buffer zone to a lesser extent than Poland, but still there, because you can see that Germany could get through Czechoslovakia and possibly even Hungary and Romania to get to the Soviet Union. But Poland's by far the biggest chunk. And then once East Germany becomes part of the Warsaw Pact, they're an extra extension to the buffer zone. So they just need to make sure those countries are allied, and the easiest way to do that is to make sure that they're communist. So they leave the Red Army in those countries, and they try and manipulate those countries into becoming communist, which means that they are not going to allow free elections. So the view from the West is that Stalin was trying to spread communism, and it was all political, whereas Stalin just believed that it was in self-defense from attack from the West. Now, at this point, the Americans had defeated the Japanese by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Stalin was even more paranoid and desperate for security and desperate for a buffer zone of these communist countries in Eastern Europe, because they had not yet developed the bomb. In light of that, there were 2 telegrams that were sent in 1946. One from George Kennan, who was in Moscow working as a US ambassador there to represent America in the Russian capital. And he sent his views on what Stalin was doing back to America. and this is a very long telegram because most of them are like text messages. They're really short. It is like an old-fashioned text message, but this one was a really, really long one, and it's known as long telegram. And it said that Stalin wants to see capitalism destroyed, and he thinks the West wants to destroy him. But crucially, he will back down if you stand up to him. So the Americans took that they must act aggressively and actively stop any extra spread of communism. Likewise, the Novikov telegram sent by Nikolai Novikov, who was Soviet ambassador working in Washington, so George Kennan's equal, and he sent a telegram back to Moscow saying what he believed the Americans were up to. And he believed that the Americans wanted to destroy the Soviet Union with their huge army, and that Roosevelt, now being dead, meant that they were more likely to do that and less likely to work with Stalin, and that the American people would happily fight and attack the Soviet Union. So they are even more desperate to build these satellite state buffer zones in Eastern Europe. In the same year, Winston Churchill was no longer Prime Minister of Britain, although he does come back in the 1950s. Says that he believes that there is now a division between the two sides. The Grand Alliance is over. They don't trust each other. That's becoming clearer and clearer. And some people think that this is the start of the Cold War, where Churchill says there is an iron curtain that has descended across Europe. So the Soviets did make all those Eastern European countries become communist, and it's done in different ways in each country. You can pause that and read the examples of how it is done. So different ways, at different points in time. You can see in Czechoslovakia it's 48, in Poland it's 47, in Bulgaria and Romania it's a little bit earlier. And so it's done bit by bit, and then you get this black line, which is the Iron Curtain between East and West. We're not going to talk about Yugoslavia and Albania right now because they're not that important, but these main satellite states here are all communist, and these countries in blue are all capitalist. And you can see that in Romania, there's a guy holding a gun, which suggests that violence was used, or at least at the very least, intimidation. So the fixing of these elections and this intimidation and this violence in different countries at different times in different ways was known as salami tactics, because you are slicing the salami. You don't eat a salami all in one go. You chop it up into little round slices, and so it's easy to digest. And that's what the Soviets did in Eastern Europe. They did it country by country in slightly different ways. That's probably a simpler way of how each country was brought under communist influence. So you could pause that and have a look. And that's what it looked like. I'm not sure you can see that. It says, can you name any of these satellite states in red? This is just the flags of the satellite states that are involved. And so you have the, well, to be fair, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, is not a satellite state. That is the country that has these satellite states. But these are Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, which are the first ones. And then we have East Germany later on. Again, don't confuse them with the countries that are part of the Soviet Union, or the republics that are part of the Soviet Union, now separate countries, but back then were all part of the USSR. Okay. So containment is the American strategy from this point. They want to stop any more than these countries becoming communist. They don't want the communism to go west of the Iron Curtain. And that is done by two different things that are very much linked: the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and then the Soviets react to that with their own Cominform and Comecon. So containment was brought about by the long telegram telling the Americans that the Russians did want to stop communism spreading, but that they should stand up to them. But what was also well known in America is that the countries in Europe, in the East and the West, were poor. They'd spent years fighting a war. They were in rubble, parts of it, and they hadn't got much money. And communists that were poor are more likely to turn to communism. So this was really brought home by the Greek Civil War, where the communists were trying to stage a revolution against the capitalists and the monarchists, and the British, who had troops stationed there at the end of the war, had, because we were so poor and bankrupt at this point, almost bankrupt, had to withdraw those troops, which allowed the communists to get more headway in this revolution. And Britain then asked for help from the USA, and the Americans gave $400 million to the British to keep troops in Greece to fight against the communists. At that point, Truman made a speech which becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, that says we must not allow communism to spread, and we will stop communism spread by giving money, not troops. They're not going to send American troops back into Europe. They're going to give money to the countries in Europe to defend themselves from communism. Because communism is evil and capitalism is good. It was that black and white for them. There was also, because Turkey is next to Greece and there's potential for communist uprising there, they gave some of that 400 million to Turkey as well. And that Truman Doctrine, that the Americans will give money to stop communism, is how containment became the official policy under the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Truman Doctrine is an idea. The actual thing that happened was the Marshall Plan, the practical outcome of the Truman Doctrine. George Marshall was a general who went around Europe and saw firsthand how poor some of the Western countries were, and that they could turn communist if they weren't helped out, like Greece was potentially going to be. And he called this a domino theory, that once one country had fallen, it was more likely with a communist neighbour that the next one would fall. The Americans at this point had a pretty healthy economy because they hadn't spent as much time fighting and they hadn't been attacked and they weren't in rubble, so they could give the money. And Truman and Marshall got the American Parliament or Congress to give $17 billion in various things to any country that was not communist. And then Czechoslovakia became communist, at which point the Congress said, hell yes. And you can see which countries got the most, and Britain was the largest recipient of that Marshall aid. And there's a nice pie chart that gives you the same, well, not the same, it gives you in percentages. So 24% went to us. And it was a gift. It wasn't a loan. It's not something that we had to pay back. It was to keep. The real name is the European Recovery Plan, but everybody called it the Marshall Plan or Marshall Aid. And they did say that Eastern countries could have some of this money if they let America review their finances, which essentially meant that they were going to force them to not be communism. Those countries, because Stalin said no, they took no part in it. And the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Ernest Bevin, said that it was a lifeline sinking men. It really was well received in Europe. So in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, not so much, particularly in Russia. You've got this cartoon where the American dollar there, and with the hat on, is resting on people who are bowing down to him, and that is clearly the Western European countries. And it's a Russian cartoon or magazine. You can tell from the writing, the Cyrillic alphabet, and you can see that Uncle Joe, Stalin's name, thought that the Americans are trying to get involved again where they're not wanted. It's not their business. And they're trying to create an American empire through money, not through conquering countries, but by buying them. And he called that dollar imperialism. And what did he do? He set up two organizations to make sure that communism would be strong. One of them was Cominform, or Communist Information Bureau, which was a political institution that would organize and coordinate and control eventually the Soviet satellite states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, etc., and Comecon, which is communist economy, which was to provide financial help to communist countries, but ended up exploiting them really. So Cominform was set up in 1947 and limited those countries' independence by giving more control to the Soviet Union. And Comecon came 2 years later. Technically stands the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, but it's communist economic policy, and they were encouraged to trade with each other, not the West. But like I said, most of that trade benefited the USSR rather than those countries themselves. So the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan made the Cold War more divisive. There'd been an Iron Curtain split up, but now they're in separate groups, which had some of them had, well, the Western countries had money being given to them by the Americans. They were allied to them via cash or financial means, and Stalin saw that as a threat and forbade the Eastern countries to do that and set up his own organizations. So now you've got more formal agreements between the Western countries and then between the Eastern countries in return. So it's clear the Grand Alliance was now over. And that leads on to the Berlin Blockade crisis, not to be confused with the Berlin crisis of the Berlin Wall, which is in 1961. So a good, well, over 10 years later. This one is where Stalin chances his arm to stop aid getting into Western Berlin, to make them become communist, essentially. So the zones have been set up as part of the conferences, particularly Yalta and Potsdam. But as you can see, likewise, Berlin had its own subsequent zones. And the western part of Berlin, the French, the British, the American zones, were being supplied by Western zones in Germany. And it was a little foothold, a little spy hole for the West in East Germany, in communist Germany, and Stalin did not want them there. Plus, the fact that they're going to be richer because of capitalism than the Soviets would be a big two fingers up to the not Soviets, to the East German communists. Would be big finger up to all communists right on their doorstep. So initially, they were allowed to travel between the two, West Germany and West Berlin, by road, rail, canal, and air. And this zone system was not supposed to last forever. The soldiers from all the nations on the streets, and military checkpoints between zones, although you could cross quite easily. And then the West wanted to make sure that they could trade with Germany, so they had tried to beef up their economy, but Stalin wanted them to stay poor and for them to stay communist and stay a buffer zone. Any talks between the two countries ended when the Soviets walked out because of this disagreement. The Soviet zone was not allowed to trade with other zones because they were communist and wanted them to trade with other communist countries. So the USA and the UK united their two zones in January 47. By 48, the French and all the capitalist zones joined in Trizonia, which essentially became West Germany after the Berlin crisis, and Trizonia was given money as part of the Marshall Plan. So it's when they created the Deutschmark as a new currency to help the German economy, that they're now two separate countries in two separate currencies, essentially. And Stalin thought that he's been ganged up on, and you can see there Bizonia or Trizonia, the zone becoming Trizonia. So Stalin decided to do something. He knew that Western Berliners were isolated, and even though that was a nice little uh, spy hole, I'm calling it, I'm not sure that's the right word, for the capitalists to keep an eye on what was going on in communist Germany, they were also surrounded by communists. So he could, and he did, stop any food coming or other supplies coming in by road, canal, and rail, because he could put his troops in the way and they would have to break through, at which point they are starting a war, and they're not going to do that. So Stalin wanted to show the Allies he's not going to be bullied, not going to be ganged up on, but he also wants West Berlin to just go, oh, we'll have to become communists then, because we're starving otherwise, so we'll give up, we'll join you in communist East Germany. So Stalin's shown that a divided Germany is not going to work in the long run, and that it should all become communist. So the West Berlin could only now be accessed via air, which meant that all food and supplies had to be flown in or air dropped in by parachutes. Otherwise, West Berlin would only be able to survive for 36 days. So the Allies, they did that. They flew in plane after plane after plane, because they knew that the communists couldn't put a barrier there. They would have to shoot those planes down if they wanted to stop them, and then they are starting the war, which they knew that they wouldn't want to do. And I like to think it as that moment in The Simpsons where they're both being aggressive, but they don't want to actually land the first blow. So Lisa's saying, I'm just kick my feet out and walk towards you, and if you happen to get in the way, it's your fault. And Bart's saying, I'm going to swing my arms and walk towards you, and if you happen to get in the way, it's your fault. They're both kind of doing that. They're going as far as they can without actually landing the first blow. And it's a success for the West because this Operation Vickles, this constant supply of goods by plane, the Berlin airlift, is very successful. It shows the West are willing to support Germany, and it means a plane every minute landing in Berlin airport. And for a year, that's what happened. And the Soviets realised they ain't going to know where to go. They weren't going to shoot the planes down, and they couldn't stop the planes. The blockade was not working, so they gave up, and a clear victory for the West. And he looked like the one who was being aggressive. You can see the flow chart here if you want to stop it now and get any details done, then be my guest. So Berlin led to this permanently divided, I say permanently, obviously after the Cold War in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down and Germany came reunified by 1990. But for the rest of the Cold War, Germany was permanently, semi-permanently split into two countries, East and West, and that became formalised in the following year, in 1949. And they became West Germany and East Germany, or we'll go through the official names in a second. It increased the rivalry between East and West, not just in Germany, but across the board. It was humiliating for Stalin, although he didn't tell the people that because he was very controlling in his propaganda. But it meant that the West set up a formal pact against communist expansion. It's called the Defensive Alliance. They're not going to attack any of the communist countries unless they get attacked first. Any of the NATO countries get attacked first. But Stalin didn't see it that way, and just as Putin is claiming now that NATO's main aim is to attack Russia or Soviet Union, that's what Stalin was saying, even though it's never been about that. It's just been to protect each other against communist expansion. By 1955, West Germany were made a member of NATO, and that was another um, real escalation of the division between the two sides. So, last little bit for today. The two countries are known as FRG, or the Federal Republic of Germany, which I always think they're missing a trick by not having the O in there, and then it'd be frog. It'd be much easier to remember. It had a separate capital, not Berlin, called Bonn, which is quite a small town, but that's their capital. It was bigger than East Germany, and it still had West Berlin as part of its territory. Now, the GDR, or German Democratic Republic, even though it's not really democratic, was set up within 5 months of the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, being set up. Their capital was Berlin, and both sides believed that their country was the real Germany. We've just been through NATO. NATO is nothing. It's North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Defensive alliance to help each other if they're attacked. It's actually the British Foreign Secretary that we've already seen, Ernest Bevin, who was a major player in this. And America is now not just offering money, but offering military intervention if any of these Western European countries get attacked. So it's a step on from containment via cash to containment via military alliances. So it allowed American missiles, not troops at this point. Well, there were some bases, but yeah, so I suppose troops, but mainly missiles to be stationed in Europe, because then nuclear missiles by this point, and they are much more threatening than actual army men. And so in Britain and Germany, and notably in Turkey and Italy, are where the American missiles are set, which does lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis to a certain extent. And these are the countries that were part of NATO to start off with, these 12 countries. Other countries joined later, like we know West Germany did. So how do you think Stalin reacted? Well, no surprise, not happy. He is saying that they are being like the fascists that they defeated only a few years earlier. But he would say that, wouldn't he? So the consequence of setting up NATO is USA is now committed to defence of Western Europe militarily as well as financially. Stalin thought it was an attack on communism. It meant that both sides are going to develop their nuclear weapons at a greater rate, and that the Soviet Union sets up this thing called the Warsaw Pact in retaliation, and the USA sets up its own missile bases in Europe. The last thing, the Warsaw Pact is the communist version of NATO, really, which was set up directly as a result of West Germany being allowed into NATO, because that meant that German troops could be stationed in Germany, and were now on the border of Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe in East Germany. And so they set up their defensive alliance with 8 countries, although unlike NATO, it was the Soviets leading that rather than a joint leadership. They're sometimes known as the Eastern Bloc, and they're also supposed to help each other if attacked. So by this point, both sides are clearly set up in different camps as rivals, and with an arms race going on between the two sides. This lasted for the next 35 years till the end of the Cold War. There's nothing new on there, to be honest. So I will end this particular presentation. Goodbye.